In the year 1636, the Sephardic Jewish community in Amsterdam found itself embroiled in a heated debate over the fate of their converso relatives residing as Christians in Spain and Portugal. Would those who refused to emigrate in order to re-embrace Judaism be denied entry into the world to come? In this class, we will explore the rich tapestry of sources that both sides invoked during this intriguing chapter in Jewish history. It was in the year 1636 in Amsterdam. The chief rabbi of the Sephardic Jewish community in Amsterdam at the time, his name was Reb Shaul Halevi Mortera. And Reb Shaul Halevi Mortera gave a speech sometime in the year 1636 to his congregation. And as he himself writes, as a result, people were not happy with what he said. And there was pushback to what he said. Let's read what he has to write. And it was the day that I was giving my lecture in public. And there were some of the youngsters, and they complained. All the people who followed that viewpoint, to the extent that to my great dismay I was forced to kind of allow it to turn into a dispute, something which is an emunah shlema, a complete emunah, a proper emunah asher kibalnu ma'avoseinu anavim, that we received from the prophets, that we received from the Tanoim, that we received from the Amoraim, and this is something that you received from the Nevi'im, Tanoim, and Amoraim. It's not supposed to be controversial. That's supposed to be something that we all agree to it, right? And yet, I was basically forced to allow the matter to turn into a dispute. And though I would say, yeah, but you guys are wrong, and that view is wrong, and what I'm saying is right, at the end of the day, the way people work is that when you present something that has two sides, people say, oh, you're saying the halacha is like this way. Oh, but there's already two sides. There's two sides to the story. It's not as simple as the way you're making it. So what are we hearing here? We're hearing that Reb Shaul Mortera gave a speech where there's a fundamental Jewish belief that in his view shouldn't be controversial. It should be straightforward. He mentions it in his speech. All the people are upset. And it really bothers him that this had to even turn into a controversy. And as much as he's going to say that, by the way, that view is wrong and my view is right, at the end of the day, now there's two sides to the story, and he's very disappointed about this. He's writing this in a letter to the Rabbanim in Venice. We'll see the role that they're going to play in a moment. Now, he says the following about why the other view is so terrible. Why it's so dangerous, the opposing view. He says as follows. Look at number 2. Haloi misham yeshanoi kol asher yemalenu liboy lashuv el eretz hatmeya. Basically what he's saying over here is that people will be at ease and feel very comfortable to go back to eretz hatmeya. What does it mean, Eretz Hatmeya, when you're in Amsterdam in 1636 and you're a rabbi for the Sephardic Jewish community there? What do you mean when you're referring to Eretz Hatmeya? So let's go back up. In 1492, the Jews were expelled from Spain. In 1497, in Portugal, they said all Jews they didn't expel them, but they said all of you have to be Christians. And they forcibly basically converted the entire country of Jews. So, there was very few places for Yidden to run and to leave at the time. The Ottoman Empire was one option. Italy, some of the places within the Italian peninsula allowed Jews in, but it was a very, very difficult thing. It took for 100 years or so for prospects to open up of new opportunities. And that's because what we call today Holland, this was an area that became independent. It used to be part of Spain under the Spanish kingdom. And it gained independence sometime around the 1580s or something like that. And they decided there's freedom of religion, relatively speaking, freedom of religion. And so they allowed Yidden to come move there. And so on Erech 1580, 1590, sometime almost 100 years after the Maisa in Spain and in Portugal, you had Jews starting to come and establish communities there. And there's a daily trickle of Jews that are running away from Spain, but mostly from Portugal, coming to live in Amsterdam. And so the community starts growing. Remember, we're talking here 1630, 1636. So it's about 40 years into the establishment of this Jewish community. What we know, when people move to a new country, it's very difficult to start a new life. The language is different. There are so many difficulties when it comes to starting a new life. And when Jews move from one place to another, you always have some who go back. And so that was a real issue then. Are people going to say, I ran away from Portugal, I wanted to live like a Yid in the open, but it's very difficult, my family is over there, my job is over there. So he's afraid that if they're right, if I don't get my way, Rabbi Mortera is saying, then that viewpoint, that dangerous viewpoint is going to lead people to say, let me go back to Eretz Hatzmeya, meaning I'll go back to Spain and Portugal. And they're going to follow their corrupt ways that's hated by Hashem. Then he goes further. Not only is it going to be a problem that it's going to cause Jews to run back, but also it's going to stop the flow of Jews from there here. He says over here, it's going to affect Jews, the Jews who are in the end of their lands of the enemies, meaning in Spain and Portugal. And he describes here the reality where midei yoim beyoim ka'av te'ufena ucheyoinim el aru b'seyam. Here he's paraphrasing a lashon of the pasuk from Yeshaya, where every single day, like a bird flying, or like doves going to their nest or their dove cote, that every day Jews are running away because they want to live like free Jews in the open, and they're able to do that in Amsterdam. But if this information that they're saying is going to get to the Jews who are still hanging out in Portugal, living there, none of them are going to leave. They're going to say, we're going to stay here. And in fact, he goes on to say, I don't know how he knows this, but he feels strong enough that he knows this. In fact, this already happened. Meaning there were people who are Marranos, converso Jews, that are living in Portugal. Again, it's a long time. It's 1636. It's a long time after 1497. But it's a few generations. They pass down, you're a secret Jew, you're a crypto Jew, in private. And these Jews, some of them were ready to come, and they were thinking about leaving and to move to Amsterdam to live openly as Jews. But when they heard this type of message and this type of messaging information from this dangerous viewpoint, then they decided they're not going to emigrate. Woe to the person who caused this type of thing. Therefore, Reb Shaul Mortera is writing to the rabbis in Venice, Lachein, Kinur, Kanu LaHashem Elekei Yisrael, you should be zealous for God. You got to say the truth. Say it the way it is. Because right now you have this tzur michshol ve'even negef. You have this stumbling block. And then he adds these interesting words. Mitzupa b'levush kabbalah. It's a wolf in a sheep's clothing. So he says it's a stumbling block in the clothing of Kabbalah. Meaning the argument of the view that he's disagreeing with is being presented as a Kabbalistic view. So basically, in 1636, in Amsterdam, there's a Kabbalistic viewpoint that's being stated that Shaul Mortera thinks is very dangerous. He gave a speech that opposed that, and the young people got really mad at him. And so we have a controversy that has broken out in the community at the time. Well, what is it that he said? What did he say in the speech that so enraged the people? So let's go to the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, where it says as follows. It describes Poishe Yisrael begufan, sinners, Jewish sinners with their bodies. This is obviously a very interesting expression, and the Gemara asks, what is Poishe Yisrael begufan? And the Gemara famously responds, this is a karkafta, a head, the loy manach tefillin, that never put on tefillin. Most Mefarshim think it means that never put on tefillin. So that's one way of describing what Poishe Yisrael begufan is someone who never put on tefillin. Some of the Mefarshim explain, and like Beshita, he's like, no, I'm rebelling against Hashem, and I don't want to put on tefillin. He's part of a member of a Jewish community, 100%. He does other mitzvahs, 100%, but he rebelled against the mitzvah of tefillin. Some of the Rishonim think that it's not lav dafka only the mitzvah of the Rambam thinks it's dafka tefillin. Some of the Rishonim think lav dafka tefillin, any mitzvah. Tefillin is just being used as an example, but it doesn't matter. For the purposes of our class, what we need to focus on is that we're talking about someone who, it's not stam an aveirele. This is someone who's committed against a certain mitzvah, but on the other hand, other mitzvahs he's keeping, he's part of the Jewish community, so what is his punishment? So the Gemara says, Yarden legehenim, they go to Gehenim, v'nidoinim ba shnei masar chodesh, and they're punished there for 12 months. La'achar shnei masar chodesh, after 12 months, what happens? Gufan kala, their body is destroyed. V'nishmasan nisrefes, their soul is burnt. V'ruach mifazarsan, and the wind spreads out the ashes, presumably, of their soul, tachas kapois raglei tzadikim, under the feet of the tzadikim. So it's obviously an enigmatic passage. It's not intuitive to understand exactly what it's saying over here, but one very fair reading of this Gemara is it's saying that this type of sinner is destroyed, is annihilated for all eternity. In Gehenim for 12 months, and then after the body is gone, it sounds like the soul is gone, ashes under the feet of the tzaddikim. And again, while we don't understand every element of the passage, it sounds like, there's a certain level of sinning that basically equals self-annihilation. That's what we're seeing over here. Then the Gemara goes further in Rosh Hashanah and says as follows: Aval haminim, if we're dealing with the sectarians, v'hamis soirois, this is someone who masers, someone who takes, who reports on a Jew, an innocent Jew, to the non-Jewish authorities, and as a result, this person is punished in a terrible way, which he didn't deserve. Okay. V'hamishumadim, in many Gemaras this was taken out, but this is the proper text. It's supposed to say v'hamishumadim, the people who converted. People converted to another religion. Ve'ha'epikorsim, this is another form of heresy. Shakafru b'Torah, people who deny the Torah, or shakafru b'tchias hamesim, people who deny tchias hamesim. V'shapirshu medarchei tzibur, people who separate themselves from the ways of the community, that they're not tying their lot with the Jewish community. And it gives another example. V'shachatu v'echtiu es harabim, and if they cause the general community to sin. For example, Yeravam ben Nevat v'Chaverev, the other kings, who they weren't only wicked in their personal lives, but they imposed their wickedness on the Jewish population, then they're going to be worse off. In what sense? Yarden leGehenim, they go to the Gehenim, but v'nidoinim ba ledoirei doiris, and they're there for all eternity. They're there ledoirei doiris, but pashtos, it means they're there for all of eternity. This is the Gemara, the Reb Shaul Mortera, Shaul Halevi Mortera, quoted in his speech, and he says he was elaborating on this. The Gemara brings a raya from a pasuk. Where do we see from a pasuk the idea of eternal punishment? The idea that certain people are going to be punished eternally. So the Gemara brings a raya from Yeshayahu Perek Samach Vav, which is the ending of the Haftarah of this week's Shabbos, because it's the Haftarah of Hashamayim Kisi that we read on Shabbos Reish Chodesh. It's the last pasuk. Because it's so negative, we read this pasuk and then we go back to the previous pasuk because we don't want to end with this negative pasuk. What does it say? V'yatzu v'ro, you'll go out and you'll see. The dead bodies of the people who sinned against me, God is speaking. The worms that are eating, consuming their flesh, won't die. The fire that's consuming them also won't be extinguished. And they will be a disgrace for all of humanity. What does this pasuk sound like? This pasuk sounds like there is an eternal type of a retribution or punishment that's taken against some extreme type of sinners. And this the Gemara is using as a raya for the people who go to Gehenim, and they're there for many generations. But as we know, this is what bothered people. People hearing this, you have to remember, mishumadim, the key word is mishumadim. What does mishumadim mean? Someone who converted to another religion. Someone who converted to another religion. That wasn't a theory. If you gave a speech about that in 1636 in Amsterdam, that wasn't a theory. That was something that every single person, either themselves was at one point was a crypto Jew, was someone who was living outwardly as a Catholic, or they at the very least had relatives, had many relatives, loved ones who were living that way. And so this Gemara is quite relevant. And to hear this type of statement, first of all, the Poiche Sor B'Gufan, someone who never put on tefillin, that definitely would have applied to many of them never put on tefillin. And to hear this type of language that sounds like that complete annihilation, that's obviously very troubling. And for them to hear Mishumadim are going to be in Nidoinim Balid Doiris also, it's a very, very troubling statement. And so the young people got up when Rabbi Shaul Mortera gave this speech, and they protested against this. They said that he himself, by the way, although he came from Spanish origin, he himself was born in Venice. His experience wasn't mamish directly. He didn't have a direct experience of this whole story. Anyway, as a result of this politics, what happened? They go to the community leaders. They go to the community leaders. V'lechein shalu, read number 5. Rabbi Mortera is writing this to the Rabbanim in Venice. Shalu me'ez parnasei havad, letzavois leval ashmiya oid ha'emes hazeh. They went to the parnasim of the community, the people with the power, tell the rabbi not to give this type of speech anymore. You think that this is something that was invented in 1960 when the Balabatim come and tell what the rabbi could and can't talk about. In 1636, they went and said, you go tell that rabbi that he doesn't say that speech anymore because we don't want to hear this. Okay, now he says 2 interesting things at this point. The first thing, and this very often comes up when Jews argue amongst each other, very often the following argument comes up. What's the following argument? What are the Goyim going to say? You hear what you're saying? Could you imagine what the Goyim are going to say when they hear this? So he says that over here. Lama yomru hagoyim, he says. That by you guys, you basically have a situation where this is a nation where katsadik karasha hagoyaza. This is you guys, if I'm wrong, and if you guys are right, that it's all good and everyone, even Mishumadim, they all, everyone essentially has a chelek lo'olam haba. If that's where you're going, so then what are the Gentiles going to say? They're going to say, look at you guys, tzaddik, Russia, all of you guys are treated the same thing. And if so, then yeah, why not be wicked? And therefore, so Jews will do anything. A Jew could be corrupt. Why? Because he knows he has a guarantee, he has a ticket straight into heaven, no problem. And so, they have no Yiras Shamayim. Now Goyim are going to look at us and going to say, all of us are corrupt. All of us are Tameh because we have this very, very dangerous viewpoint where essentially Shol Halevi Mortera feels this is a viewpoint that stresses our actions don't matter because it's all good if these young people, the protesters, are right. And then he adds a very emotional argument. And he says as follows: Va'efoi timtza kinas Hashem va'avasai asher lavsha ha'harugim usrufim al kedusha shmoi. Where? What's going to be? How are we supposed to make sense of the zealous misiris nefesh that people died for Kiddush Hashem? Why? Why do they do that? If in the end of day, mikra echad lahem, they will be in the same place. If you have one Yid who took the Torah and threw it into the flames, and you have another Yid who himself was burnt by the Inquisition. This was a real thing for them at the time. I once showed here in one of the classes, there's a siddur printed a few decades later in the 1680s. In the siddur, there's a bracha of the tefillah that you say when you hear that a cousin or a neighbor was burnt in Spain or Portugal at the stake. This is the tefillah that you're supposed to say. One for men, one for women. This is like a real thing. So what are they doing? Why are these Yidden saying, no, I'm going to die al Kiddush Hashem? And this has been happening for so many years. If these young whippersnappers are right, and I'm wrong, so then what happened to all this? What is this Mesiras Nefesh? Really? The people who were the martyrs, so to speak, are going to be in the same place with the great sinners? Okay, so this is what he's writing to the rabbis of Venice. Now, what he does is as follows. The reason he's writing this letter to Venice, not because he on his own is looking for support. The community leaders in Amsterdam basically said, we can't, we're parnasim, we're lay people. How are we going to resolve this issue? There's a theological question here. So let's turn to our sister Jewish community. This happened. We saw in other class, this happened with another country. You turn to a sister Jewish community and they're going to help us out. So the Parnasim said, we're going to send a letter to Venice, and you basically write your point of view. The other side is going to write their point of view, and the rabbis in Venice are going to understand. So we've been reading everything that we saw till now. We've been reading from his letter to Venice. Fine. So now what does he do? What he does now is he says as follows. He says, I need to make a case. How does a rabbi needs to back it up? How do you back it up with? You have to give Talmudic arguments. And so he writes, you guys are Rabbanim, you know everything. I need to give you the arguments. Okay, but I have to do it, so I'm going to give you the arguments. And what he does is first he brings psukim, which we're not going to quote. And he brings a few psukim that show this view that we're not talking about the average sin. But the point there is a certain class of sinners. And you can have a debate, by the way, who's in that class or not. That's not relevant, because everyone would agree that a meshumad, someone who is living like a Christian and has the ability to leave, but is staying there, everyone would agree that that falls in the category of like this extreme sin that's highly problematic. And the question is, for that type of person, is there this idea that, no, at the end, they'll reach Olam Haba? Do we say that they're going to reach Olam, or no? And so he brings a few psukim to make his point and that, and then he brings chazals. We're going to quote just one chazal that he brings. So what's one chazal? Besides for the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, which was his speech that we quoted above, we'll quote one more chazal that he brings in his letter to the Chachamim in Venice. The Mishnah in Sanhedrin, Perek Yud, reads as follows, and now that we're saying Pirkei Avos every week, so we're saying this Mishnah at the beginning of each Perek. Kol Yisrael yesh lam chelik le'olam haba. Every Jew has a portion of Olam Haba. Now that doesn't really sound like him, but hold on. The Mishnah continues, and with this we don't say every Shabbos. Ve'elu she'ein lahem chelik le'olam haba. And here are those who do not have a chelik le'olam haba. Number one, ha'omer ein tchiyas hamesim min ha'torah, someone who denies tchiyas hamesim. Number two, ve'ein Torah min hashamayim, someone that denies the divinity of the Torah. Number three is apikoides, a certain type of heretic. Okay, then the Mishnah goes on. It gives more examples. Then it says the following: Shloisha malachim. There are 3 kings. Va'arba hedyotais, and 4 regular people. Ein lam chelik le'olam haba. Who are the 3 kings? Yeravam, who is mentioned in the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Zayin. Mentioned, it said Kigoin Yeravam ben Avat v'Chaveirav. So here it mentions Yeravam, another Achav, and Menashe. And that's what the Gemara Rosh Hashanah Yud Zayin meant when it says Yeravam v'Chaveirav. It means these kings, these are 3 kings from Malchei Yisrael who were notorious for their wickedness, and they're Elam Chelik Le'olam Haba. What more do you need over here? You see that there's a certain line that can't be crossed, and if you cross that line, Elam Chelik Le'olam Haba. This is proof for my view, says Reb Shaul Halevi Mortera. And then, after he brings the Chazals, he then brings Rishonim. And he brings many Rishonim. We'll just quote one. He brings from Rabbi Yosef Albo. Rabbi Yosef Albo is known as the author of the Sephardic Ikrim. He lived in Spain in the late 1300s. He passed away in the 1440s on Erech. And in this work, Sephardic Ikrim, Rabbi Yosef Albo writes as follows. He says, Ki l'soinei Hashem, the people who are God's enemies, va'abilti shomrim mitzvaysav, and they don't observe the mitzvahs, yeh oinsham nitzchi. See those words? Yeh oinsham nitzchi. Their punishment will be eternal. V'zeu sh'amar rabbeinu zal, and this is what the rabbis meant when they said, she'em yarden legehenim, they go down to Gehenim, v'nidoinim ba ledoirei doiros, and they will be there ledoirei doiros. In other words, ledoirei doiros means for all of eternity. Those who accept the basics of Judaism, but they struggled and sinned with certain sins, so then the punishment will only be temporary, and here's God's kindness, and so that's different. So what do you see? Shaul Mortera points out, you see Rabbi Yosef Albo, the author of Sefer Ikrim, saying that he's understanding Chazal as recognizing a class of sins that basically cut someone off forever and ever. Now, when he sent his letter to Venice, the other side also sent a letter to Venice, though it's not entirely clear who authored that letter and where it is, because it hasn't surfaced till today. Now, what happened was, it was sent to a balabas in the Venice Jewish community. This balabas showed it to 2 rabbanim. The 2 rabbanim that he showed it to, their names are Reb Shmaya de Medina and Reb Zaya Figo. Now these 2 rabbanim were not official rabbanim of Venice. They weren't part of the Bezdin. And basically they were having a discussion, should we bring this debate to the Venetian Bezdin or not? Well, these 2 rabbis who weren't part of the Bezdin said, it's better if you don't bring it to our Bezdin. It's not a good idea to bring it to our Bezdin. Why is this so? So they write a letter to Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab. We'll talk more about who Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab is in a second. But they write a letter to Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab, who's in Amsterdam, and they write to him why they thought it was not a good idea for them to bring this letter to the Rabbanim. What's the reason? So they say, very simple, Haskamas kulam imatzad hamachayev ha'inish hanitzchi. Because everyone agrees. All of us agree that there's something called eternal punishment, of course. You will not find any Talmudic rabbi or Jew, anyone who follows a Talmud, who disagrees with this. So therefore, if we're going to put out a psak din, this is not going to be respectful for the losing viewpoint, right? When you have a viewpoint that's so wrong, and the Venetian Bezdin is going to put out a psak din that's going to say that Shaul Halevi Mortera is right and the other view is so wrong, it's going to be very embarrassing. And that's one reason not to do it. And the Eish HaMachloikes Tislav Yoser, in fact, it's going to feed the fire of the fight, loy sichta. And the fight is not going to dissipate. Why? Kidas avas hanitzuach achasi. The religion, I think the laws, or the religion of wanting to win, that's one and the same. It's universal. We all know how it works, basically. No one wants to lose a fight. and no one's going to back down because the Venetian Bezdin sent a letter that said, you're wrong, and so therefore you have to back down, what's going to happen? They're just only going to pull out more aggressive response from them. They're going to recommit themselves to this idea and fight even more. It's something we see all the time that happens. Okay, so therefore, what was their idea? Their idea was not to do a psak din. Okay, no marnu hamachzik bisvaras bitul einish hanitzchi. The one who doesn't believe in eternal punishment, the only solution is hu me'atzmo yevatel daitoi mipnei dazu losoi. He has to basically change his mind. That's what we need to get. How do you get someone to change their mind? You don't get someone to change their mind when you write a public letter against them. Okay? If you ever want someone to change their mind, don't write a public letter because it's not going to happen. How do you get someone to change their mind? You know, privately, a back channel. And so they sent a letter addressed to those people, basically saying, you guys are so wrong. We're not going to send up psak din. We're not even bringing it to our rabbanim. It's like maybe these are secretaries of the Bezdin. I don't know exactly what their role is. The rabbanim aren't going to speak. You guys need to back down and basically get up and say we were wrong. And that's the way to resolve this crisis. They're writing this to Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab. Then they write, so we thought everything is good and it's all going to be resolved. However, a few months went by and we found out that the machloikas didn't stop. And each view is still saying what they're saying, including the wrong view that does not believe in eternal punishment. This view is continuing to promote this thing. So they write to Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab, we just heard that the machloikas is still exactly where it was. And then we learned a new piece of information. What's the new piece of information that we learned? The key promoter that denies eternal punishment is none other than you. Huni Umar is you. You, Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab. The Doirish Kain LaRabin. And you darshan this publicly, bepumbi. So this is very upsetting for us, they write. Such a big Talmid Chacham like you got caught up in this, they write. They said this was very depressing. But then we realized, fakert, this is, they wrote very diplomatically. Then we realized, fakert, precisely because you're such a great man, precisely because you're such a big Talmid Chacham, and precisely because you love the truth, we're going to tell you that we'll be able to work this out. That what? Yefarsim and the Yachrids were asking you to get up in shul and announce, so you understood the truth. And you make the arguments, and you know how to organize them and make them craft your arguments. You can basically figure out how to make the best arguments for the right cause. And we're not going to tell you what to say. You'll figure it out, but this is what we're asking you to do. So who is this Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab? Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab, this year is 1636. He's not the chief rabbi, but he's a rav for the Sephardic community in Amsterdam. He himself grew up as a crypto Jew in Portugal, and then made his way over as a young man to Amsterdam, and so he had a little more direct experience of the things that we're talking about today. He's very famous for, a few years after this, in 1642, he traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to Brazil. And in the north of Brazil, there was a community that began over there, a Jewish community in Recife. Okay, you have to say, but it's spelled with an R, right? R-E-C-I-F-E, Recife. And there was a kehillah of Dutch Jews that went from Amsterdam there. They brought him as their rabbi. And so as a result of that, he's actually the first rabbi. Yitzchak Abuhab is the first rabbi on the American continent in this thing. This is in 1642. Now what happened was, this didn't last because Brazil was conquered a few years later, taken from the Dutch by the Portuguese. The Portuguese have the rule of the Inquisition, no Jews allowed. And so the Jews there had to leave. So Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhab went back to Amsterdam and he continued and ended his life over there. Anyway, so this is him. He's a very important Talmid Chacham. And we're finding out that he was the promoter of this view that says there's no such a thing in Judaism as eternal punishment. And he's being asked to back down. Well, you probably imagine that he didn't back down. Rather than back down, he wrote a book. It's not a long book. It's a very short book. He never gave it to print. The printing press existed at this time. For whatever reason, he never gave it to print, and it existed in manuscript. It was printed for the first time in the 1970s, and then it's been printed a few times thereafter. It's about 20, 30 pages of writing defending his view. He calls it Nishmas Chaim. So we'll do a little overview of what he writes in this book. So the book begins as follows. The question that I got, is there such a thing as a punishment to a nefesh, a soul that is eternal? Number one. Question number two. When Chazal said there are certain people who don't have a portion, what does that mean? Tshuva. The answer is, right away he lays the ground rules down. Who has a right to have a seat at this table to join this conversation? He says only mekubalim. If you're not a mekubal, get out of the room. You don't belong as part of this conversation. Anytime you want to talk about an neshama, that's not for a Talmudic scholar to talk about. That's only for a mekubal. Obviously, he himself was a mekubal. In fact, in this Nishmas Chaim, he writes that he had a teacher whose name was Avram Herrera. Avram Herrera was a Jew, grew up in Portugal, living as a Christian, made his way out, came to Amsterdam. A very prominent mekubal. Avram Herrera's teacher was a man by the name of Yisrael Sarug. Yisrael Sarug's teacher was the Arizal, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. And so in this tshuva, he writes, my teacher was Arizal's grandson. What he meant by that is that the Arizal had a student, Rabbi Yisrael Sarug, who had a student, my teacher, Avram Herrera. In other words, he viewed himself essentially as the Arizal's great-grandson. Okay? And he's saying, so we are the ones who are going to be able to be kaveya here, the reality or not, because this is a Kabbalistic question, it's not a Talmudic question. There's no reason for us to follow or to rely on, to lean on the path that was taken by the Jewish philosophers. What he means over here is Rambam, not necessary to, and others, including right now, he lays in a ouch for the Ikrim. Look what he writes here. We will not turn to the Chacham Rabbi Yosef Albo, ki al boy be'inyan hachachma hamekubeles. Here, al boy. He doesn't have in him. He basically is punning his last name. Al boy hat nicht the chachma hamekubeles. And he's a philosopher. He's chakira. The Ikrim wasn't a mekubal, and so So one of the sources that I showed you before, Shaul Halevi Mortara brought, was from the Ikrim and made a big deal out of it. You could quote the Ikrim from today to tomorrow, and has zero impact on Rabbi Yitzchak Abua because he's not a mekubal. Then he says another thing. By the way, you see here his sharp language. This may be why he never gave this book to print. Perhaps he realized that the language here is a little sharp. I'll show you another example right now. He says here in number 10 that my opponents bring proof from Mekubalim. This is true. I didn't mention this before. Shaul Halevi Mortera does psukim, does chazals, does rishonim, and he throws in a few Mekubalim as well. He himself wasn't a Mekubal, but he threw in a few quotes from Mekubalim. Well, this enraged Rabbi Yitzchak Abuav. You're basically using my territory, my turf, my expertise. You're using it, and you're not an expert in this area. You shouldn't be doing that. So he writes, you're quoting Mekubalim, and you don't understand them. And then he says, there is a wise saying, everyone says what they know, but not everyone knows what they say. Okay? So you saw a little Kabbalah, you quote it. Why? Because you know it, so you quote it. Everyone says what they know, but you don't know what you say. You don't really understand what you're doing. Another example of very sharp language. So now he says as follows. The key, now he's going to also bring in a Christian side to the conversation. Remember before, Reb Shaul Halevi Mortara said, what are the Christians going to say? The Christians are going to say that you guys have no morality because a tzaddik and a rasha end up at the same destination. So he does a different type of Christian argument. What does he say? Chazal never meant eternal punishment. And he writes, God forbid that we should accuse God of such guilt. In other words, to him, it's inconceivable that a just God would eternally punish someone. Let's push it off the table from a moral standpoint. And then he says, if you disagree with me, now you're getting close to the Christian view. You're getting close. How is that? Because they say, They say that sin is forever. They say that sin is eternal, and he's quoting some Christian theology here. And that's why they needed their Savior to come. Who has eternal powers, and Yekabel ha'oinish, and he will receive the punishment, which is to die for our sins, in order to atone for all of mankind. So he's quoting here the doctrine of the idea that everyone is sin, and there's no way out of sin. There's no way. The only way out of sin is through Yeshu HaNotzri, is the only way out of sin. Okay, so these are two separate ideas. But he's saying it sounds a little similar. Here, sin is like so eternal for all of humanity. Sin is so eternal, Christian dogma says. It's so eternal for all of humanity that you need to have the Christian Savior to get you out of it. And you're saying that there are souls that are punished eternally. So the word eternal is used in both conversations. It sounds similar. So you're the one who's inching toward Christian theology, and this is a no-no. Now the truth is, what's the main nekuda of his argument? The main nekuda of his argument is a very, very simple point. It really all boils down to how you understand what a neshama is and what a nefesh is. And for each one of the rabbis who are involved in this discussion, you ask a very simple question. What is a neshama? What is a nefesh? And based on what the answer would be, you could basically end up in two different places. Many of the philosophers, when they discuss neshama, this includes the Rambam and others, when they discuss neshama, they spoke about it as an intellectual power. It's an intellectual thing. The Rambam spoke about it this way, the Ikrim spoke about others as well. Okay, so in other words, it's a nivra. It's a nivra. There's a table, there's a chair, and then there's a neshama is very special, more special than a table or chair. Okay, fine. But at the end of the day, it's a nivra. However, with the Mekubalim, you see this in the Ramban, some of them, and then it gets really, really amplified in the generation of the Arizal. With the Kabbalah of the Arizal and his students, we start seeing very strong the language of the neshama is a chelek aleika, is a part of God. Now we all understand. Once you do that, there's no turning back. Because a part of Hashem means eternal. God is eternal. A part of a God is eternal. The idea that a part of God is going to be eternally lost, destroyed, in Gehenim, all these things just don't make sense the second you understand that a nefesh is a chelek aleika. And he makes this point very clearly in number 12. How could anyone imagine to impose an eternal punishment on the neshama atahira, on a pure neshama. And you're basically blemishing something holy, which is, here he uses the words, chelek aleka mimal, which is a neshama chashuva, the chashuv neshama. Mikisei hakavod chatzuva, it is carved out from the kisei hakavod, from God's throne. It's a sulam mutzav arza, yes, it's in the body, its legs are on the ground in the body, but Rosh Hamakia Shamayma, it's all the way, it reaches all the way to the top. You're going to start talking about eternal punishment. This is not really possible. What about those chazals we had? So each one of these chazals he explains. By the way, it's a lot. He brings a ribui mekoros. Most of them are from Kabbalah. But at the end of the day, he also needs to explain how does this work in the chazals that we saw before. So first up, there's the Chazal that said that the people who is the Poshe Yisrael Begufan, they are the Poshe Yisrael Begufan. Their ashes go. The body is destroyed. We'll come back to that later. The neshama is burnt, and their ashes go under the feet of the tzaddikim. So how that sounds like the neshama is destroyed. So what's pshat? So he says in number 13, what the Gemara means there, this refers to a doctrine in Kabbalah. He brings sources from the Zohar of this. The idea that a tzaddik goes into Gehenim and schleps out neshamas from the Gehenim and brings them to Gan Eden. That's what this is a reference to. So the ashes are under the feet of the tzaddikim because the tzaddik is the one who schlepped them out. What about the next piece of the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, where it says in the real bad ones, the heretics, the Meshumadim, the Moisrim, the Yeravam ben Avat, and there we said that it's a worse punishment. And there we said that L'doirei doiris, forever. That sounds like eternal punishment. Kfar B'yarti, I already explained, because I'm bringing the quote from later on in his work, Hakol niskan b'soida ibur. Everything is corrected through the soid ibur. What's soid ibur? This is what we more commonly call Gilgul. The idea that the neshama is going to come down once, and then it'll come down again into another body, and then it'll come down into another body, and it could eventually go into non-human existences as well. And through this process again and again and again and again, even the worst neshamas eventually are going to be corrected. The Gemara said that these neshamas are punished l'doidei doidis. Don't worry, calm down. Don't worry about l'doidei doidis. Why? You have a pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim that says va'avadei la'olam, that after the slave is drilled in his ear, he becomes a slave la'olam. What does la'olam mean? Okay, so calm down with l'doidei doidis. It's okay. It means a long time. Don't get carried away and think like the way others said that it's nitzchi, that it's going to be forever. What about ein lam chelek lo'olam haba? You said ein lam, there's certain people ein lam chelek lo'olam haba. So look what he says in number 14. Amram ein lam chelek lo'olam haba haratzain ala guf. That's only referring to the body. The body taka is not coming back. Yeravam ben Avat's body can't come back. Those people's bodies can't come back. Because dirt returns to dirt. But the spirit, but the neshama, the divine soul, that will have the privilege of beholding Hashem in Olam Haba, in the body that purified this neshama. Whichever body eventually in the long history of Gilgulim is going to eventually purify this neshama, so the neshama is going to come back into that guf. And so ein lan chelek l'olam haba is only going on the guf, but the neshama is going to have a chelek l'olam haba. And then he says, go back to that pasuk that we say in the Haftorah, where he says, go out and look at the bodies of those people, and the worms are always there, and the fire is always there, and it's going to be a disgrace, right? What does it say over there in the pasuk? Daganami tiksiv v'yatsa v'ro b'pigre. It says, go look at the what's the peger? The peger is a soulless body. That's what a peger is. So where is eternal punishment? Eternal punishment could be to a body, not to a soul. Kimilas pigre yirmois ala guf b'li neshama. That's a reference to a guf without a neshama. He then says, and by the way, I'll give you another pshat. He brings from earlier Mekubal and brings from Reb Menachem Rekanti, who himself brings from earlier Mekubal named Reb Ezra, who was a teacher, they say, of the Ramban. And this Reb Ezra says that you see sometimes it says, Ein lam chelek l'olam haba. You know what it means? It means every tzaddik has his own mother. These are concepts, these spiritual concepts, hard to fully understand. We don't have to do a full explanation. Every tzaddik has his own mother. These people, they're not going to have their own individual mother. It's going to be like for everyone else, the public one. They're not going to have their own mother. That's what it means. Okay, so these are some of the options that he gives for how to navigate these chazals, but let's come back to the principle. The principle is a neshama is divine. Divine is eternal. You can't imagine that being cut off, being destroyed. There's no such a thing. Or being in some sort of Gehenim forever just doesn't add up and it doesn't make sense. And so therefore, we have the concept of Gilgul. Gilgul is going to allow the rectification for the neshama. And these passages of chazal, each one needs to be interpreted in accordance with the ways that he just gave. Good. Obviously, I'm summarizing over here much more. He brings many, many nikoides. Now we come to the conclusion, some points that he brings up at the end. And he says as follows. He says, if you're going to say, look at number 18. If you're going to say, people say, they accuse me. Remember what Shalom Terra said? That the conversos in Portugal, they're not going to come out anymore. They're going to stay there. Why? They heard. I'm good. Even if I live as a Catholic, I'm going to be totally fine. If you want to say that, he says, Ein safek, go down a few lines. Ein safek, shemisha yishma kedvarim ha'ela yilag lamai. No doubt that anyone who hears this would laugh this away. Why? Ha'im katan beineim ha'inish, shatan ha'shnafsha makama alfei shanim. The idea of being punished for thousands of years means nothing. All I said is that eventually, after many rounds of Gilgul, your neshama is going to return to the source. There's nothing to sneeze at. And then he goes further. Bouncing around, this reference to Gilgul. And the fact that the body is not going to come for Tchias HaMesim, all these mean nothing. See, Gilgul is a difficult process. Thousands of years of punishment, that's difficult. Losing the body for Tchias HaMesim, that's difficult. I think we have enough of an incentive for someone who takes Schar Va'inish seriously. I think we have enough of an incentive for someone living in Portugal to say, you know something, if I have the ability to leave, let me leave. Let me go to Amsterdam and live as a full Jew. So he completely rejects this argument that Reb Shol Mortera said that it was a disincentive for Jews to flee from the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition. Then he concludes, the last piece we'll read from him says as follows. Hamachish masha amarnu. If you disagree with what I say, then by definition, yachish hagilgul. It means you disagree with Gilgul. This is a topic for itself. There were Gdolei Yisrael that didn't accept the doctrine of Gilgul. The same point, by the way, that I mentioned before is relevant to that too. That is, any Gadol Yisrael that understood the neshama as chelek alikam imal, by definition accepted Gilgul. You will not find anyone who says the neshama is chelek alikam imal mamish, and by the way, I reject Gilgul. All the rejectors of Gilgul are when the neshama is not chelek alikam imal, so then all of a sudden the question becomes, why Gilgul? Why do you need it? What's the function? What's the purpose? But now you understand why there's a purpose to it, because if it's something divine, then it needs to be restored to its source, so then you need to have it. So he says, you shall levim mortera, you're essentially denying Gilgul. That's what he says. And v'shamaiti, v'sheim achishim shamaiti, I heard that indeed he denies it. In other words, he's not, Shal Levi Mortera did not deny Gilgul publicly. In fact, in his works, he referenced it here and there. But he's accusing him of not really believing in the concept of Gilgul, because they don't understand its benefit. And then he concludes and says, what I have been saying is the secret of what Chazal said, and they often say, this is the Gemara in Sanhedrin that says this famous line, I'm not sure why he says meragla befumayu, that they say it all the time. The Gemara says it once. But he says this is the deeper meaning. What do Chazal mean when they say Afal pi shechata Yisraelu? Kafilu shechata. Even the sinner. You're not going to be cut off from the tree. Amnam Yisrael, you remain as a Jew. Even though he converted and went away from God, and took on new gods. He will eventually be called the name of Yisrael. So you see what's going on over here. For him, when he's talking, it's like, yeah, my cousins who are living in Portugal, who are remaining there, are they still a part of us? And they're not leaving, they're staying there. Are they still a part of our people? And do I still, as a cousin or a brother or an aunt or an uncle or a friend, do I still have a relationship with them that's meaningful? And for him, the answer is yes. For Shal HaLevi Mertera, the answer is no. Now, everyone agreed, if you do tshuva while you're living, you're all good. They all make that very clear. There's no disagreement. Tshuva works, is effective for anyone, anytime. But the debate was, what if someone isn't going to do tshuva? So Shal HaLevi Mertera was very concerned. He wanted to have an incentive for people to run away, and he thought that his view is the one that's going to be the better result for the Spanish Portuguese Jewish community. Rabbi Yitzchak Abuab thinks fakert. He thinks that his view still has a strong incentive to run away if you're able to, but then at the same time, for a Jew that's living in Amsterdam and a brother, a friend is living in Portugal, I'm still connected with them. They're still part of the Jewish people. I assume that this was more of a comforting view for those Jews. Okay, now let's fast forward a few hundred years to the summer of 1943. When the Rebbe came to America, the Frierdiker Rebbe put him in charge of a few moistus. One of them was Machne Yisrael. Machne Yisrael, one of its key missions in the early 40s, was Mishnayis Baal Peh. What does this mean, Mishnayis Baal Peh? They basically, you would get a community together, you would divide the whole Mishnayis, everyone will get a few prakim that they needed to learn Baal Peh, and then you'd go out on the street for a few months. Your job was to chazer those prakim of Mishnayis Baal Peh for Taras HaAvir. And then you make a siyum. After a few months of knowing it and chazering it many times on the street, there was a siyum. So there was a siyum here in 770, in Sivan, Tafshin Gimel, Yud Zayin, Sivan, Tafshin Gimel, there was a siyum for the Mishnayis, because they had made the division a year earlier. The Frierdiker Rebbe said a sicha by the siyum, and then the Rebbe made a hadron. The Rebbe made a hadron on the Mishnayis, and in Rishimis we have, the Rebbe wrote notes of what, either before he spoke or after he spoke, or what he's going to say. Anyway, what happened was that there's a letter written about a month later to a chassid named Reb David Stockhammer. Reb David Stockhammer was the father-in-law of Rabbi Mentlik, the father-in-law of Reb Moshe Pinchas Katz, the father-in-law of Reb Avram Ziskin. He had he was here in America, and he basically sent his daughters to Europe to marry Tmimim. And so this is Reb David Stockhammer. David Stockhammer lived in Newark. He came in for the siyum. He's there by the siyum, he hears the Rebbe talk. He hears the Rebbe say, Kol Yisrael Yoshen Chelech Olam Haba, every Jew, no matter what, even Yeravam ben Nevat, every single person gets Olam Haba. And like happened in the 1630s, where this matter was controversial, David Stockhammer asked the Rebbe, what? Where did that come from? What about all the Chazals that say they don't have Olam Haba and they this and Oynish and Itzchi? He knew this stuff. Look, the Rebbe writes in a letter back to him about a month later. Ba'asher Tama al asher amarti behemshich hasiyum shas mishnah bal peh. You're wondering about what I said. What did I say? Asher kol echad mi Yisrael yeh miyishia, that every Jew, no matter who, afilu Rasha Gam, or even a complete Rasha, kol yamav yesh le tikva. So all of his days he has hope. V'sayf, and at the end of the day, im birtzaynai dekfil mamayla, whether he wants or it will be coerced upon him. Im b'chayav la'achar moisei, it can be during his life or later. Ma'ali and oisem misharei atuma, he will be elevated out of the negative forces, asher nishka bahem, that he's sunken into. He will be made to go through different elements of purification. Ad asher gam hu misached v'davek b'sharsha, he will reconnect with his source, which is Or and Sof Baruch Hu, godliness. You are asking, asher tamoa adavar, this is bizarre. V'yesh kama stiris, and there's many stiris. Okay, the Rebbe wrote a long essay in response. A year or so later, there was Koivis Lubavitch came out. The Rebbe re-edited this letter and published it there. We'll obviously just summarize a few brief points from this. The Rebbe basically goes as follows. Step 1, I will bring you sources that show you that even one of the people who, so to speak, beyond the pale, could have Olam Haba. What's the source? Could. First step is just could. What's the source? Yerushalmi. Look at the Yerushalmi in Kelayim as follows. Rabbi Chanina asked Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, when they're talking about Tchias HaMesim and Olam Haba, Afilu kegon Yeravam ben Avat v'chaveirav, when we say this concept of Tchias HaMesim and Olam Haba, what also Yeravam ben Avat? Now remember, the Bavli said he's the example kegoin that doesn't, and he's the example of Doirei Doiris in Gehenna. Amar lei, so the answer was Gofris v'amelach srefa chol arza. This is a pasuk in Devarim that says the sulfur and salt burning up all of the land. Now the Yerushalmi says, what type of answer is this? What does this mean? So the Gemara explains, Kivish and Nisrfa Eretz Yisrael nasa behem midas hadin. This is a pasuk in Parashas Nitzavim, and it's talking about an eventual negative circumstance that's going to happen in Eretz Yisrael. The Yerushalmi is saying, and it happened. What happened? The entire earth, the entire Eretz Yisrael was punished with fire and brimstone, whatever. It's referring to the Churban. Okay. So when that happens, so the body of Yeravam ben Avat was impacted. And when the body of Yeravam ben Avat was impacted, although it wasn't geared for him and wasn't intended for him, but the end result was his body, his grave was impacted. And because his grave was impacted, so therefore he's going to get Tchias HaMesim. This is how the Pnei Moshe, the classic commentary to the Yerushalmi, tells us to understand this. What do you see over here? You see the very same person who is the prototype in the Bavli for the person who doesn't have Olam Haba, who has eternal punishment. And here we see in Yerushalmi, not so simple, not so simple. So step number 1, could you say that even someone in that classification ends up having Olam Haba? Yes. Okay, then you come to the second step. And that is, will they? Will they? So the Rebbe says, I'm going to bring you a Gemara, a Bavli, that's going to show you that yes, they will. What's the Bavli? Eidav and Chavalaf on the base, and it says as follows. Te'enim ha'toives, the good figs, is tzadikim gemurim, righteous people. Te'enim ha'rois, the inferior figs, elu rishoyin gemurim, this is a reference to complete wicked people. Maybe you will say that the complete wicked people, their hope is lost. No. The flowers gave forth a positive smell. Both the tzaddikim and the rishonim gemurim are going to give forth a good fragrance. So essentially, what is that saying? That they're going to be part of the process. So not only do we see that it could theoretically happen, like we see being mentioned for Yeravam ben Avat, but here we see a blanket statement that this will happen. Good. Now the next step is the Rebbe is going to say it must happen. Why must it happen? So it's going to come back to the idea we spoke about earlier. Once you recognize that an neshama is eloka, is elikos, then by definition it has to happen. So for this, the Rebbe quotes a Talmud of the Arizal. As I said before, much of this idea, both about the neshama being a chelek eloka, and therefore the idea that the neshama can never be cut off, and by extension the idea that therefore Gilgul exists, and there isn't a limit. There are views that say only 3 times. But no, these 3 pieces kind of come together, and you see this much more by the Arizal and his students than anywhere else. Yeah, you can see hints of it in other places in Kabbalah, but these 3 ideas. Number 1, neshama is a chelek eloka mimal mamish. Number two, it's therefore eternal, and there cannot be a oynish nitzchi. And number three, therefore there's an unlimited opportunities of Gilgal. All three of them are needed because they all complete each other. And you see this in Reb Shmuel Uzida. He was a Talmud of the Arizal. He wrote the commentary to Pirkei Avos Medrash Shmuel, and he basically writes this idea. He writes that the key words here is, he says, Kol haneshamas, every single one, yituknu kulam, every single one is going to be corrected. He connects this to the pasuk of Amech kulam tzadikim, and then he quotes the famous, this is brought in the Talmud of the Arizal uses a lot, the pasuk that is said in Sefer Shmuel about God, that the Eibusher was chashav machshavos levilti yidach mimenu nidach. This comes from, we can't get into it now, but it comes from the story of Avshalom and David, where basically the woman tells David HaMelech that God never banishes the banished ones. In other words, everyone comes back. Eventually God accepts everyone, so you could accept Avshalom as well. So that pasuk bilti yidach mimenu nidach he's using over here, and this is why not only could and will, but therefore must. How is this going to happen? So here the Rebbe brings from Reb Chaim Vital, who is another student of the Arizal, and Reb Chaim Vital writes b'mefurish what Reb Yitzchak Abuhav was writing in Nishmas Chaim. Remember, Reb Yitzchak Abuhav said it's only the body is going to be destroyed, but the neshama is going to come back. Reb Yitzchak Abuhav did not have a 100% clear source who said it. How did he get it? He got it from his teacher, who got it from his teacher, Yisrael Sarug, who got it from the Arizal. And that's why we find that Reb Chaim Vital, who was a student of the Arizal, he wrote it in his Sefer Al-Gogol, in Perek Dalit. He writes the same idea, that someone who's undeserving of Tchias HaMesim, so then that neshama, whichever body ends up housing the neshama and doing a lot of good with that neshama, so that's where that neshama is going to end up going by Tchias HaMesim. The Sefer Al-Gogolim was only printed in 1684. So in other words, it wasn't an accessible sefer during this whole time, and so therefore it wasn't one that could be quoted, but we're able to see how this was a strong emphasis by the Talmidim of the Arizal. The Rebbe then concludes with a very interesting point, and that is a diuk in the Lashon of the Mishnah of Kol Yisrael Yesh Lam Chelek Lo'elam Haba, and then we say Ve'elu She'ein Lam Chelek Lo'elam Haba. The Rebbe points to the fact that often in Mishnah, the way it would do it is as follows: Kol Yisrael Yesh Lam Chelek Lo'elam Haba, Chutz Me, except for, and then you give your exceptions. And there brings a few examples. That's how the Mishnah works. In fact, the Mishnah is b'derech katzer, and we see that the Gemara is particularly, the Mishnah shouldn't even do one or two extra letters or words. So that's shorter. Ve'elu she'ein lahem chelek l'olam haba. That's a whole phrase to introduce the people who aren't on the list. Really, it should be Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek l'olam haba chutz mi, and then give me the list. No. Because if you say chutz mi, then it's basically saying Yeravam ben Nevat does not have chelek l'olam haba. That's not the pshat. What is the Mishnah trying to say? Kol Yisrael yesh lahem haba. Every single yid, including Yeravam ben Nevat, every single last yid has a chelek l'olam haba. Ve'elu, and here are those that their bodies Ve'elu, that their bodies don't have a chelek l'olam haba. Oh, so I couldn't say chutz. If you're saying chutz, you're excluding Yeravam ben Nevat from the Reisha. You can't exclude him from the Reisha. Yeravam ben Nevat is a proud member of the Reisha. He's also a member of the Sefer, because they're not a stira. One is for the soul, one is for the body, and this is the Rebbe's a novel idea of taking the idea from Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhav. Obviously, the Rebbe was not familiar with Rabbi Yitzchak Abuhav's stuff because it wasn't printed then. But taking this idea from the Talmidim of the Arizal and then finding this diuk in the Mishnah. So as we read now Pirkei Avos, and we're reading the Kol Yisrael at the beginning of the Pirkei Avos, they say that death informs life. So rather than the focus on what's going to be after life, is to really focus on what does this mean for how we live life. How we live life, to live life in a way of Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek L'olam Haba, to recognize this idea that I have a neshama, that's a Chelek Elikami Ma'al Mamish, that's a part of Hashem. And when a person knows that, so not only it impacts what's going to therefore happen after Mea V'Esrim, really it's supposed to impact what happens today. Because the second we recognize that we have that part of our identity, then it becomes our achrayus to feed it and to give it what it needs, because otherwise it's not happy, and then we're not happy, but we want to be happy. And so the way to do that is to feed the neshama with all the good things, and that's one of the things when we say Kol Yisrael Yesh Lahem Chelek L'olam Haba, and we recognize that thing is that it can have a profound impact on how we live our lives today.